So here we have the HeroQuest game system by Avalon Hill. This is a remake of the original 90s Milton Bradley game that first got me into miniature and tabletop wargaming. So we've got the contents here. You've got the miniatures, the books, there's the nice board, and underneath that is a couple of other things that you need to play the game. Some different card tokens for the stairs and traps and things. And then underneath all of that, there is a second container which has all of the terrain, the doors and things like that. So here's the models. The first thing you'll notice is that they are a soft plastic and they have these mod lines on them, which I found a bit annoying to remove. So I actually did not remove the mold lines. Instead, I sprayed everything in Wraithbone except for the gargoyle, who I sprayed in black. And I'm going to start painting the skeletons. I'm going to start with Skeleton Horde, and I'm going to put that over all of their bones. And I actually thought once I got this on that it looked a little bit dark. So what I ended up doing after I finished painting the models is I got some Wraithbone, and then I just did a light dry brush just to increase the brightness, bring it back to a more white bleached kind of color. Next I got some Gore-grunta fur and Agros dunes. The Gore-grunta fur I'm going to use to paint the leather parts of their armor, and then the Agros dunes is for the fur that's sticking out of their gauntlets and their leg braces. Next there's Pterodon turquoise. This is somewhat similar to the box art color of the cloth on these skeletons, so I'm going to use that. And the cloth that's wrapped around their scythes is similar. Next, I'm going to use some wildwood to paint the wood section of their scythes. And now I'm going to paint the metals. So I start off with Black Legion in this case. I'm going to undercoat all the metal parts, and now I'm going to use a lead belcher to paint over the top of the black. Next, I'm going to use Agrax Earthshade for these guys and go quite heavy, and it makes their metal look sort of old and pitted and a little bit rusty compared to Nuln Oil. Now I'm going to use some Necron Compound to just lightly feather and create a little bit of edge highlighting there. Now I'm going to use some Black Templar to paint the cloth that's wrapped around the head of the scythe. And lastly, I'm going to use some Nihilic Oxide to paint in his eyes and mouth and look like he's got this sort of undead glow, like he's being animated by a necromancer or something. So this is the skeletons done. I think they look pretty good, even with the mod lines visible, which annoys me a little bit. Next, we've got the mummies. So these are going to be pretty easy, I hope. I'm going to use Skeleton Horde again, but this time I'm not going to do the Wraithbone dry brush, so it's a bit darker, and I'm going to put this on very heavily and just paint the whole thing. Next I'm going to use Rattling Grime to paint the bits of mummified flesh that are sticking out of the bandages in some parts. So I just go around and find those. It can be a bit hard to tell. Next, I'm going to use some Blood Angels Red to paint inside the mouth and the tongue, and I'll just use some Skeleton Horde to do the teeth. And lastly, I'm just going to use again some Nihilic Oxide to paint his eyes to give him that glowing feeling. So there's the mummies, nice and easy to get those guys done. And last, sticking with the undead, I've got the zombies. So I started off with Dreadful Visage. So I went and painted the skin, but it looked a little bit too pale and ghostly and inhuman. So I went back with some Reekland Flesh Shade and went over the top of that, and it gave it a better look, like a flesh look, but with that purple undertone, like he's a bit rotten. And then I went with some Carroburg Crimson and filled out all the little sort of rents and tears and boils on his skin. I just went over the top of those with that Carroburg Crimson. Next, I'm going to use Rattling Grime to paint his pants. So once that's done, I'm going to use Gore-grunta Fur to paint the front of his shield. It looks like there's sort of some leather stretched over the top of the shield, so that's for the front. And then for the back of the shield, where it's the unadorned wood, I'm going to use wildwood. And while I've got that out, I'm also going to paint his shoes, and then also his belt, and the stitching that's on his pants might as well all be the same color. Next, I'm going to use Flesh Tearer's Red to paint the cloth that's wrapped around his sword arm. And then I'm going to paint the metal parts, same as the skeleton. I'm going to use this same technique a lot with all these models. All of the metal parts, I start off with a black, and then I use lead belcher to paint over the top of that. And then depending on if I want sort of a rusty corroded metal or not, I'll use Agrax Earthshade or Nuln Oil. In this case it's Agrax Earthshade. And then finally I'll just do some sort of dry brushing, light dry brushing with Necron Compound, mostly catching just the edges of that metal just to make it shine out, make it look like it's scratched a little bit. So once all that's done, I'm going to go for Basilicanum Grey to paint his hair, and I'm going to then use some Blood Angels Red, the same as the mummy, to paint the inside of his mouth, and then Skeleton Horde for the teeth. Again, the same as the mummy, and then the same as the other undead, I'm going to use Nihilic Oxide to paint his eyes. So that is the zombies done. I think they look pretty good. There's a bit of a hair sticking on that one. And now I'm going to move on to the greenskins. So I'm going to start with the goblins. And for the goblins, I thought I would use a Gut Ripper Flesh. But when I started putting it on, I thought it looked a bit flat. This is a different flesh that I use for my Warhammer Orcs. So I'm going to then go over the top of that with Bieltan Green. To give it a nice deeper kind of texture and get into those shadows and provide a lot better contrast. Next, I'm going to use Agros Dunes to paint their clothing. So some of them have hoods and others don't, and yeah, different loincloths depending on what goblin is. And I'm going to use Garagak Suez to paint their leather and some other bits and pieces. Next, I'm going to do all of their metal parts again, and like I said before, this is going to be a fairly standard process, except for these guys. I'm going to also use some Retributor armor to paint some of their bits, some of their earrings and things like that. But aside from that, the technique is the same, Agrax Earthshade to shade it down, and then I don't actually highlight the gold, just the silver parts with the Necron Compound. So once that's done, Skeleton Horde to paint some of the teeth and details that these guys have in their clothes or wearing as trophies. And then some of them have some fur that I'll paint in the Skeleton Horde as well. And then once that's done, I'm going to use Blood Angels Red to paint their eyes. And then there's also a couple of other details which I'm going to use the red for, some gems on some of their daggers, and then also this guy's got his tongue sticking out, so I'll do Blood Angels Red there. Next I'm going to use Gore Grunter Fur to paint some of the necklace leather, just to give it a little bit of a differentiation between the Garagak sewers. So now I'm going to use Black Templar to paint the hair on the female goblins. There's a little bit of hair. I wasn't sure what color to go for, so I just went basic Black Templar. And then that is the goblins done. There's 3 different variants there. So there's the female one, the guy with his hood up, and then there's another one with his hood down. So yep, that's the goblins done, and now I'm going to switch to their bigger cousins, the orcs. So there's 4 different sculpts for the orcs. I tried to do some different skin tones with these guys. So I started off with orc flesh, but I didn't really like how that turned out. It was, again, a bit flat, and I didn't like the tone. So I tried with Krieg Camo, and I thought that was just maybe a bit too dark. Again, yeah, didn't really like it, so I ended up just doing the same as the goblins, the gut ripper flesh. So I had to strip some of those test models and then repaint them, and same as the goblins, I'm going to use BL Tarn Green to give the model a lot more depth and shading in the recesses. So now I'm going to do the metal parts because these guys are mostly armored. So yeah, there's a lot of metal on these orcs, and there's just some little details which I'm going to pick out in gold. And yep, Grax Earthshade to shade it all down, get it in there nice and thick, and then highlight it up with the Necron compound. And once all the metal is done, I'm going to use wildwood to do all of the leather strapping that's holding all their armor plates on. There's quite a bit of it, so you just work your way around and find all those leather straps. And I'm going to use some Gore Grunter fur to do their loin cloths. And also some of their weapons have wrapping on the handles, like this mace here, so I'm going to do that in Gore Grunter fur too. Now, like the goblins, I just decided to use Black Templar for the female orcs who have hair. And now I'm going to use Skeleton Horde just to pick out their teeth. And then I'm going to use, like the goblins, Blood Angels red for their eyes, and also any of them who have their mouths open. And then I also decided with these guys to paint their nails in Dark Angels green, and later on I went back on the goblins and did them in Dark Angels green too. So there's what the orcs look like. They're looking pretty good. Next up is the Abomination. So these were previously called Femia in the Milton Bradley version. So going to paint them first with Apothecary White in the lighter sides. I sort of want to do a two-tone, but I thought that was a bit too clean, so I decided to go over the top of that with a Reekland Flesh Shade to give a bit better shading, and also to make it look a little bit human, like these might have been sort of half man, half fish kind of things. Next, I use Stormfiend to go over the scales, and I used some contrast medium to sort of blend it into the skin parts, so it transitions. Next, Wildwood, I'm going to paint their belts with Wildwood, and then also the handle of their spear trident thing. Next, I'm going to use Basilicanum Grey for the loincloths. So just fit that on nice and heavy. Next, I'm going to paint their metal parts. So yeah, again, it's a little bit repetitious with all of these models having lots of metal parts to paint over. So yep, same process again with the Agrax and with the Necron compound to highlight it. But for these guys, I also used Agrax Earthshade to paint the barnacles that are all over his back. And then once I finished that, I went back and completed the metallics. Now I'm going to use a Volupus Pink to paint the gums and inside of his mouth, and then I also decided to use that same pink to paint the starfish that are on his arms as well. So he's got one on each shoulder basically. Next I'm going to use Skeleton Horde to paint all of his claws and also his teeth and the spikes sticking off the back of his forearms. And now I'm going to use some Iandan yellow to paint his eyes. So that is the Abominations done. I think they look pretty cool. And next up, we've got the Dread Warriors. So I probably should have undercoated these guys in black because they are mostly armor. So I had to go and paint basically like 90% of these models in black. I use Black Legion and I use a big brush to do so. So yeah, I think depending on what the main color of your model is, might be better to undercoat in black and then just re-undercoat any of the parts that are not black. So in this case, just the cape and the horns essentially. So I could have done that. You can see with these guys, instead of Agrax Earthshade, I'm using Nuln Oil to shade them down because I thought they would probably take a bit better care of their armor, or it might be magically clean somehow. Unlike the undead and the orcs, who wouldn't really care if their armor got all pitted and corroded over time being in a dungeon. So once I've done all the metal parts, just a couple of exposed undersuit parts I'm going to do in Black Templar, and then the horns on the helmet and the wood of the mace, the handle of the mace, I'm going to do in Wildwood. Now I'm going to use Flesh Terror's Red for their cape and their loincloth. So their capes have quite a lot of depth in them, so make sure it gets all in there. And I also use this Flesh Terror Red to paint the eyes that are on the armor and the shield. So lastly, I'm going to do some Blood Angels Red to paint their eyes that are glowing out from under the helmets. And this is what they look like. Pretty simple, but quite intimidating enemies. So that's all the kind of minions done. So I'm going to move on to the characters. So the Gargoyle first. So I undercoated him black, and I'm going to use Mechanicus Standard Grey. I'm going to do kind of like really heavy dry brush on him first, going sort of from a top down wherever possible, and then I'm going to do a second layer of highlight, a lighter one with Grey Seer. And according to the box art, that really would be it, but I wanted to give him a bit more color than that, so I decided to paint the weapons. So I'm painting the handle of the axe in Wildwood, and then I'm going to paint the wraps that are around the axe and the sword, and also the blades that I'm going to paint metal in Black Templar. And then I'm going to paint the same metal technique that I used for the Dread Warriors. So Lead Belcher. I'm going to paint a little bit of gold on this guy as well, some of the glyph details, and then I'm going to use the same Nuln Oil to shade it down, and then Necron Compound to highlight it. And then I also went back and I painted his eyes in Blood Angels Red as well, even though it's not detailed here. So here's what he looks like. He was nice and easy. Next up is the Necromancer, or the Dread Sorcerer. So I'm going to start off with Croak Green. I decided to paint his skin as a first tone to give him kind of like a kind of rotting kind of look. And then I went over that, like some of the other skin tones that I've done so far, in Reekland Flesh Sage, just to make it look a little bit human. So once his skin is done, I'll start off with his cloak, and the outer cloak I'm going to do in Shyish Purple, so it's really dark kind of purple. I'll make sure not to get the little details on the cloak, because I'll paint those later in a different color. But the inside part of his getup I'm going to do in a lighter purple, so Leviathan purple I'm using for that. And then the detail on the edging of his cloak I'm going to do Ultramarines blue. I'm not sure if I'm totally happy with that color. Maybe I should use Stormfiend or another color, but decided to go with Ultramarines blue there. So now I'm going to paint all his metal parts. So one thing that's different about this guy is basically all of his metal parts are gold. He doesn't really have any silver on him. So just need the Retributor armor there, and just going to dull that down with some Nuln Oil. I'm going to use Flesh Terror's Red to paint the gems that are on him, so this front part and some of the other jewelry that's on his necklace, and his wristband has some gems inlaid into it. And then I use some Nihilic Oxide to make his eyes glow, as well as if he's animating all those undead. So that's what he looks like there. And now I've got the heroes. So I'm going to start with the Barbarian. So I'm going to use Dark Oath Flesh for him. It's a really sort of tanned dark flesh color. And while I started on him, I decided to do all of the hero's flesh first because it's kind of the messiest. So for the dwarf, I'm going to use a Fire Slayer flesh for him, so that's an even darker flesh tone. So and I actually did 2 coats on him to give him really, really dark skin, so just get it into his big muscles. And for the wizard and the elf, I decided to use Gilliman flesh for them. So for the wizard, I just used it undiluted, but then for the elf, I decided to dilute it with contrast medium to make it really pale skin. So once all of the skin is down, I'm going to go back to the barbarian and I'm going to paint half of his loincloth in Gore Grunter fur. And then for the other half of the loincloth, I'm going to use Achelian green. So it gives it a bit of a pop of color, so it's not just entirely just browns. So I'm going to then use Skeleton Horde to paint the fur that's on his armor and also on his boots, and then I'm going to use Wildwood to paint his belt and his shoes and some of the wraps on his wrists and things. Next, I'm going to use Black Templar to undercoat the metal, and then while I've got it out, I'll paint his hair in that as well. And then, yeah, I'll paint the metal parts, so mostly his silver, but there is some gold parts, like the pommel of his sword is gold. Next, I'm going to do the same technique, dull it down with some Nuln oil, and then highlight it up with Necron Compound. Also painted his eyes too, but that was a bit fiddly to record, so that's what he looks like there. Nice and simple. Going to switch to the dwarf, and I'm going to use Leviathan Purple to paint his undershirt, and then also the edging of his mail shirt. It's kind of like half mail, half cloth. So I'm going to now paint most of the rest of him in Black Templar because he's mostly either black or metals. So go around there, but he has some kind of armor over his mail shirt. I didn't know what color to do it because I couldn't see the reference art, so I just decided to do that in Wildwood. Maybe I should have done that in Leviathan Purple as well. Not sure about that, but I did it in Wildwood, as well as the ropes that are around his shirt and his wrists. Now I'll do the metal. So he's got a little bit of metal on the weapons and in his hair, but he also has quite a bit of gold. So I'll just pick out all the gold pieces and shade them down with the Nuln oil and highlight them with the Necron Compound. And then after that, he's got a lot of gems, so I use some bright colors to do the gems. I think there was some Magos purple and some warp lightning in there, so just went around and picked out all of his gems. He's got a lot of rings as well. And there's the dwarf done. Really happy with how he turned out. Now I'm going to switch over to the wizard. So he's got the least amount of armor. I'm going to start with his shirt, and I'm going to do that in Iandan yellow. So a nice yellow color there, and I couldn't figure out exactly which green to use for his shirt, so I used Eldari Emerald. It's a little bit bright compared to the reference art, but yeah, I think it makes him stand out. And then for his cape, I'm going to use Leviathan Purple. Now I'm going to paint his boots and his belt with Gore Grunter fur. And after that's done, I'm going to paint his hair, and I'm going to use Agaros Dunes to do that, to give sort of kind of like a sandy blonde hair. Now I'm going to use Flesh Tearers Red to paint his headband, and then I'll do all of the gold parts on him. He's got some gold and silver, so undercoat those in black. Leadbelcher for some of the little buckles and his ring and like the little clasps that hold his cloak on, I'll do in silver. Yeah, and then his staff and things is gold. So yep, just go around and do those gold, get the Nuln Oil out and shade it down. And next for him, I'm going to use, well, I started off with Nasdreg yellow to paint some little designs on his tunic, but it didn't really stand out too much, so I switched that to Griffhound orange. So he's got some little some dogtooth kind of patterns, and he's got a moon and some stars and stuff. So I decided to just freehand those, and that's what it looks like. I think it looks pretty nice in the end. So we've only got one more hero to go, and it is the elf, and she is mostly armor actually, so I'm going to paint all of her clothes and armor pieces in Black Templar. This saves a bit of time compared to using Black Legion because, yeah, some of her parts, like her wristbands, the inside of the wristbands, I want to keep black, not do them silver. And Black Templar looks better. So I'm going to use Runefang Steel as opposed to Leadbelcher for her armor because it's just a lighter, shinier color. Going to do the same as the other ones and use Nuln Oil to give it some shading. I'm also now going to go back to the Runefang Steel and just like really lightly dry brush her mail, so it's got a bit of a silver tinge. Now I'm going to use Stormhost Silver to highlight her sword and her armor. Next I'm going to use Nighthaunt Gloom for her cloak, and as I started putting this on, it really wasn't the color that I was hoping for. It didn't really look like a lot like the box art. So I used some Drakenhof Nightshade to give it a much more blue color and give a lot more contrast in that feather cloak. So once that was done, I used the Gore Grunter fur to do some of the leather parts. It's mostly actually just the belt that is in Gore Grunter fur. And now I'm going to use a couple of bright colors to paint her little potions. So I've got some Orc Flesh, some Frost Heart and Magos Purple there. And now I'm going to use some Snakebite Leather to paint the tops of those bottles there to make it look a bit like cork. And now I'm going to do her hair, and I'm just going to use Apothecary White to do her hair. And lastly, I'm going to use some Pilar Glacier to make the runes on her sword, make them look like they're sort of glowing. So that is the elf done, and that is all of the heroes done. So now I need to go and do their bases. So I'm going to start with Abaddon Black to paint the rim and the top of the base. So I just use a big brush to do that, but be careful around their feet. And now I'm going to use a technical paint, Astro Granite Debris. And I'm going to spread it on like really thinly, and I should have actually spread it even thinner than I did. To make it kind of look like a tiled floor. So I really just wanted just a little bit of texture on it. So anyway, once that's down, I'm going to dry brush Ulthuan Grey. I tried to find a grey that looked somewhat like the tiles of the hallway. It's not quite exact, but it's close enough. And then I thinned down some Agrax Earthshade and put it over the top just to make it a little bit dirtier. And then I just need to clean up the bases with black again, just to get rid of some of that Ulthuan Grey. And here are all of the models finished. So I think they look pretty good, nice and bright, nice contrast. The bases tie everyone together. And I also painted all the terrain. I didn't record this, but I mostly used dry brushing and just flat colors on that, so it was a bit of fun. Here's all the little skulls and things. Now for the fireplace, I printed off the original painting of the king that was in the Milton Bradley set and stuck it on there, and I also stuck the skulls and rats and things just randomly on some of the furniture pieces. So there you have it, and with that everything's done. So yeah, fun little project, a bit of nostalgia, and hopefully I'll be able to play it, because HeroQuest, although it's a very simple game, I have a lot of good memories of playing it, and it's just a bit of fun. So hopefully you enjoyed that. There's 100 different expansions for this, so I might paint some more in the future. But with that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.